Hello. So I wanted to talk about this new angle, this new theory about coronavirus, not so much as a respiratory illness, but as something that is unmasking the toxicity of our environment, where pollution is the problem and not the virus so much. This is brought forward by Dr. Zach Bush in this interview with Del Bigtree on the Highwire. Very good interview. It's over an hour long. So I've clipped a little segment here. And obviously we all know that there's a lot of pollution in the world. I'd say most people are not ignorant of this fact. And certain parts of the world, and within those areas of the world, there's varying levels of pollution. And pollution is breathed into our lungs. Apologies for the baby noises. So if you hear any baby noises, that's my newborn son. And pollution is breathed into our lungs, and this affects the severity of respiratory infections. And it seems there are higher levels of cyanide in our environments now, in the air. And this is how apparently COVID is amplifying this effect, and that's why people are blue in the face and the oxygen isn't getting to their cells. And that's why they feel like they can't breathe, because they don't have oxygen. So I'll let Dr. Zach Bush go into this, and can talk about it more afterwards.
So the protein, there's a new protein, we're told, and we'll figure this needs to be proven out still, but we're told there's a new RNA strand, a new that codes for a new protein that is different than SARS and MERS. Okay, great. But something in SARS and MERS did the same thing. And so there's been something stable in these coronaviruses that is unmasking in a small percentage of patients this hemoglobin type effect. So then should we say, well, it's the virus causing it? Well, if it was the virus causing it, again, everybody who was exposed would have that. So what is the virus doing? The virus seems to be unmasking toxicity of our environment. And there's something really poetic about that. The people that are dying from this are by and large in areas where there's high agricultural residues of Roundup and high residues of small particulate air pollution, smaller than 2.5 microns. And so Northern Italy, New York City, Seattle, Louisiana, those are all the highest areas in Europe and the United States of those two phenomenon, agricultural toxicity coupled with air pollution and small particulate matter. In China, that happens to be Wuhan and that whole Hubei province. Hubei province has the highest Roundup and kind of destruction of the soils, and then Beijing and south of Beijing has the highest concentrations of the air particulate. And Hubei is toxic. We're talking about levels of micron particulate that are 40-fold that seen in New York. And so massive toxicity in the air pollution in Hubei. And so in that air pollution, we know it carries many things, including cyanide. And so cyanide, we know, is a part of normal air pollution. In fact, a really nice Earth Justice paper got released just months before this whole pandemic story unfolded. There was a Earth Justice mandate for kind of a class action lawsuit demand on the EPA for not accounting and not doing anything about the rising levels of cyanide in many of the U.S. cities. And we were above safe thresholds of cyanide over and over again, and there was nothing being done. And so Earth Justice recognized that, and then months later we see people dying of something that looks like cyanide poisoning. And so that what I think is interesting is the possibility that nature, in a toxic stew of dying soils in a glyphosate Roundup intense farming area of China, has unmasked the relationship of cyanide to hemoglobin. And is this an adaptive event happening as nature has exuded this? If this is a military operation, again, they are mimicking something that happened in 2001 too, and so it's not new. They've recreated, and it looks to have a much lower death toll than SARS did. SARS, we seem to have a death toll maybe around 8%, 10%. It's hard to know because we didn't really do good universal screening. May have been a lot of asymptomatic people with SARS too, but certainly this time around, I think we see a much lower mortality rate. It's down in that 0.1 to 0.3% range, probably something like that. The most recent Stanford study looking at Santa Clara as an entire city population is coming in around 0.1%, something like that. So,
Right.
So we're somewhere around normal flu and mortality. So if it's new, if it's military, their agenda is not to kill people maybe, and they don't know what they're playing with. So is there a virus? Yes. What is it doing? It seems to be unmasking the toxicity of our environment that we've created. And the virus itself is not enough to cause the death. We have to have the perfect storm of air pollution. And every 1 micron increase has a 20-fold increase of death by that Harvard study. Every 1 micron of air pollution. And when I tell you there's 40 fold increases in that micron density in Hubei, the chances of having an epidemic of hypoxemic injury in there is catastrophically high. You're in the hundreds of fold increased risk of death by living in that environment. And so we saw the death rate suddenly drop to near zero, not because they were in confinement. I believe it was because if you look at the tracking of their air pollution levels, it went below 40 microns per cubic meter of air in the 2 weeks following the cessation of activity in Hubei. And so by stopping human activity, we took the cyanide out of the air and suddenly nobody was dying of COVID.
So one of the key points that was mentioned was this lawsuit or complaint. The EPA must protect communities from hydrogen cyanide exposure because the hydrogen cyanide levels are above the quote acceptable safety limits, so they're in excess, and the symptoms of alleged COVID infections are this lack of oxygen, like being at the top of Everest or 30,000 feet in the air with a cabin that depressurizes and you're just oxygen deprived, hypoxia. So this is very interesting. He goes more into explaining it throughout the video at various points. It's very long. And another thing I wanted to bring up was the exposure to pollution and how this is the air pollution is linked to higher COVID-19 death rates. So here's the study he was talking about. Exposure to air pollution and COVID-19 mortality in the United States, a nationwide cross-sectional study. And the main point is, for every increase in 1 microgram per cubic meter, you have an 8% increase in COVID-19 death rates. And of course, they're using the inflated death rates, but that's all they have to go on. This means that only a slight increase in long-term pollution exposure will increase death rates by 8%. According to the data on the death counts, which admittedly are inflated. And the COVID numbers are inflated pretty much everywhere. In Canada, one example is a grandmother dying of dehydration due to hospital neglect, but it was counted as a COVID-19 death. I have an account of this from someone I know. So that's a fact in Canada, and it's probably going on elsewhere. So according to the study, you have a higher chance of dying if you have lived for 10 or more years in an area with 1 microgram per cubic meter of pollution more than someone else who lived with a much less pollution. With that much less pollution. Countries with higher pollution levels will be the ones that have higher numbers of hospitalizations, higher numbers of deaths, and where many of the resources should be concentrated. Looking at the US, this would help to explain some of the high death counts in some US cities, like New York especially. China has rising numbers until the lockdown, rising numbers of dead people from COVID-19 until the lockdown, which these rising numbers of deaths seems to have peaked when they initiated the lockdown at the peak. So it's also possible that the number of deaths dropped when the lockdown forced people to use polluting technologies less. So less transportation and less industry polluting into the air. So as Dr. Bush says, this might be why the numbers dropped. They were probably at the peak. The lockdown was into effect, and so we can't be too sure, but I think he has what he's talking about in here. He makes a lot of good points, and I think pollution plays a large factor in COVID deaths, especially since the effects of hydrogen cyanide are difficulty breathing, turning blue, lack of oxygen. It deprives the cells of oxygen. That's what it does. And that's what's happening in COVID patients. So I'll probably talk about this more at another time, but for this video, I just wanted to mention this idea that coronavirus is unmasking the toxicity of our environment, and that pollution is more the problem than the virus. The virus is just making us more susceptible to the pollution in our environment, which is already there. So that's it for now. Have a good one. Peace.